Hello, welcome to episode 359 of the podcast This is Whole Life. The name of the podcast is Follow Me Out of the Boat. And in case you haven't noticed already, I am not the usual host. My dad, Randy McGray, the regular host, decided to bail on me because he's sick. I thought we were doing the podcast together, and now I'm doing it by myself. So, just keep that in mind, please. Ever since Pastor Jeff's sermon, my dad has been looking for a cheap boat on Facebook Marketplace. He's thinking of putting it in our backyard and inviting Pastor Jeff over. Oh no. The thought that I took away from this week's sermon was when we tire of waiting for Jesus to do things on his time, we rush ahead and we do what we want. But when that happens, we get into the huge storms of life. When we finally look to him because we're scared out of our minds and we don't know what to do, he calls us to go outside of our comfort zone, even though we feel like we already are. So, after my takeaway, we are now getting into the questions and comments from the chat. First question is from Anonymous. Do you think this was also a lesson to show us to have more faith because Jesus stated to Peter, "Ye of little faith"? So Jesus knew that he, and by extension we, have some faith, but want him and us today to have more faith by keeping our eyes on him only through good times and big storms of life. Anonymous, that was a very good question. I agree with you. I think it was also a lesson to show us to have more faith. Me personally, I have found that it is easy to get into the cycle of everything's cool, my life is great, and then I don't need to talk to Jesus as much. And then everything starts digressing, everything's horrible, and then I cry out to Jesus, "Jesus, help me. I don't know what to do. Save me." And then everything's peachy. So then I pray less, and then giant downhill plummet. And then I call to Jesus again. It's hard to get out of that cycle. Talk about riding waves on a boat. Our second question comes from Mom Doc. In our modern life, would the boat be our status quo, our modern living? Does getting out of the boat possibly mean we are willing to leave our comfort zone and come up close to Jesus and expand our mission to wherever he sends us? Or is there another lesson I may have missed? I thought the same thing. Like, what would be the boat? I think maybe the boat is something that brings us comfort. That maybe Jesus is saying, okay, that brings you comfort, but you need to lean on me more when you need comfort. But also, do we only want to make Jesus our boat when times are good? Do we want to trust him when times are bad? And then when times are good, we're just, okay, Jesus, thanks for guiding me, but I think I can sail this. Also, how do we react to peer pressure when we hear Jesus calling? How do we react to peer pressure? Well, what is peer pressure? Maybe it's our friends telling us to stay in our boat, to stay with them where it's comfortable, in our nice AC houses or our favorite show, and who knows? Everybody's boat is different because there's many different types of boats. I feel like your question shows that you're keyed into knowing this can be a problem, and I agree with you. So, I have a question for all the podcast listeners. It has to do with John 6:17 through 21. But as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed across the lake towards Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them, and the sea grew very rough. They had rowed 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat. They were terrified, but he called out to them, "Don't be afraid, I am here." Then they were eager to let him in the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination. That was from the NLT version for anybody who wants to know. Now, how are they immediately back to shore? Had they rowed? Did they row that far and then they rowed 3 to 4 more miles? Or are we to take this literally as they rowed 3 miles and then suddenly they were there? Because I looked this up on Britannica, and it says at the widest, the Sea of Galilee is 7 miles across. So is this the first recorded instance of somebody teleporting across the lake? Tell me your thoughts. I'm going to go with T. Cinco's comment in the chat of, I love how scripture sometimes leaves you with more questions than answers. Share your opinions next week. Send them in to 407-965-1600, send it, or send it in to podcast@WholeLife.Church. Okay, so there was a question in the chat from Allie, and the question was, did Peter walk on the water? Yes or no? Ken Wetmore said that is my understanding too, but I haven't researched the Greek that the text was originally written in. So, listeners, tune in next week to see if Pastor Ken has researched the original Greek text yet. Dun, dun, dun. Anything to add? Let us know by voicemail or text. By text, you may remain anonymous unless you want to tell us, because, sometimes you want recognition for your questions. And hopefully my dad will be better by then, hopefully. And he will share by reading your comments or playing your voicemail on next week's episode. Next week's sermon, it's a doozy. We have 2 sermons in one day by 2 different people. First service will be by Pastor Ken Wetmore, and his sermon will be about Follow Me Out of Jerusalem. Second service will be by Senate Chaplain Barry Black. The title of his sermon will be Follow Me Out of Your Doubt. Join us next Tuesday evening for Speaking of Grace, and of course, Wednesday morning as usual for episode 360. Thank you for listening and have a great week.